Yes, would you ask Mrs. Cooney to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, you
Yep,
ready to carry on?
I am. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cooney, thank you. Just a couple of follow-up questions flowing from the topic we were examining before lunch. First of all, did you ever ask Mr. Soanes or Dr. Barker for a history of the previous fires at Grenfell Tower?
No.
Why is that?
It wouldn't be normally something that you would pick up in a fire safety strategy. It would be more, that is a standard question for a fire risk assessment.
Right. I see. Just generally, as at 2012, what was your awareness in general of the history and experience of fires in high-rise residential buildings?
Generally in line with what you might expect for somebody doing the job I was doing. So yes, I was aware of various like landmark fires.
Any landmark fires stand out in your mind?
Lacanau. There was, I believe, there was a couple of cladding fires. There's quite a big one in France. There's one in Scotland as well, was there?
Yes.
Various fires I was aware of. Yes.
Yes. You mentioned Lacanau. From the fire safety engineer's perspective, what was the big lesson learned from the Lacanau house fire?
From my understanding of it, there were two major causes of the fire. That's the external walls, spread over the external walls of the building, and there were compartmentation defects because of the scissor stairs.
There were. But what was the takeaway, if I can use that expression, for a fire safety engineer such as yourself?
Takeaway was to ensure that that the building materials were appropriate for the building, and that any defects, repairs, etc. were well, it shouldn't happen in the first place, but if they're remediated.
Okay. Can I ask you then to look at your draft existing fire safety strategy? That's TMO 10001925. There it is. Have you read it recently?
Yes, I have.
You have. So I can take it, can I, that you're familiar with it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it's dated, as we can see at the bottom of page 1, the 16th of August 2012, and it's marked as a draft, watermarked as such, across the front and indeed all other pages. And we can see from the second page that it's there, prepared by you and reviewed by Dr. Claire Barker, Principal Consultant. You see that? I'm going to come back to that review process later. But can I just show you something above that box? There's a smaller box which says reason for revision. And it's issue number D01. Is the D draft?
It is, yes.
Right. And reason for revision, first draft.
Yes.
Does that tell us that what you produced, this document, was is clearly as a first draft, but that there was intended to be perhaps a further draft and then a final version?
Typically, that would be the process, yes.
Right. Can you explain why the document was issued with the word draft over it if it was the final version?
It wasn't the final version.
Have you seen? I'm so sorry.
Sorry, I don't know whether that's what you understood by my last response, but it wasn't. It was just a first draft.
It was just a first draft. Did you ever do a further draft?
No.
Do you know whether anybody else ever did a further draft?
Not that I'm aware.
Have you ever seen a final version of this document?
No, I haven't.
Would it be usual for you as the draftsperson of this document not to see a final or the final version of the document that went to the client?
It really depends on feedback, to be honest. So a document would remain as a draft until all parties were satisfied that it covers everything it needs to cover.
Very well. Well, we'll come back to that in due course. We see on page 3 the contents page. If we can just look at that. And you can see there that from part 4 onwards, part 3 onwards, in fact, you've addressed the main functional requirements, B1 to B5, yes?
Yes.
From B1 to B5 at parts 3 through to 7. Now, despite the fee proposal referring to Section 20 of the London Building Act 1939 and also the RRO, as we talked about earlier, there's no mention of those in the contents page, is there?
There isn't, no.
No. Do you know why that is?
I think principally because when we're looking at a fire safety strategy, whilst it does there are large overlaps with the RRO, and obviously the local acts such as the London Act and others which have now been repealed would be there's quite a lot of overlapping requirements, so the information in terms of what we had for those elements probably didn't have enough information to really complete a full section on those at that time.
I see. If you go, please, to page 5, we can see the introduction, and you can see what's set out there. And in the 4th paragraph of the introduction, do you see it says, it is expected and therefore assumed, you see that? That the existing building has been built to the prevailing standards of the day. You see that? Mm-hmm. Could you just read the rest of that paragraph to yourself?
Yes.
Now, on what basis did you form that expectation or assumption?
On the basis that the building, having been long-standing in the same use as it was constructed to be used for, and the very stringent adherence to acts such as the London Act, Section 20, etc., and the requirement for a fire risk assessment being in place for several years prior to, I think it was a reasonable assumption to assume that any works that had been carried out had been done in a workmanlike manner, and that there was no significant deviations from the guidance.
Did you take any steps to ask the TMO or investigate with them, or indeed Studio E, whether the existing building had been built to the prevailing standards of the day?
No.
Why is that?
Because the layout of the building from the information we had gave that information within it in enough detail.
Right. So can I take it from that answer that you took no steps to verify that the existing building had indeed been built to the prevailing standards of the day?
I didn't ask for certification or anything like that. No, I didn't.
If you look at the 5th paragraph, the existing fire safety strategy states, it is assumed that the various provisions required it's a bit difficult to read, of the above legislation, I think it should mean by the above legislation, have been maintained since the building was constructed, and subsequent amendments have been carried out with the approval of the regulating authority of the day. See that? Mm-hmm. When you talk about various provisions being maintained, what do you mean?
So if there's the compartmentation, so if there's work's been carried out which create holes, that they've been properly sealed, that everything's been maintained as it should be. So lifts, risers, dampers, any kind of system which relies on maintenance of detection systems,
Right.
things of that manner.
So just to be clear, do you mean there that it was assumed that the building had been maintained to comply with the prevailing standards at the time of construction?
No, so maintained so that they would meet their performance requirements for the time that they were put in, or as amended, I suppose.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, on what basis did you make these assumptions that you set out here?
Reasonable good practice.
Right. Again, am I to take it that you didn't ask the TMO or Studio E as to whether those assumptions were sound?
I did ask some questions about the ventilation and the detection systems, and we asked quite extensively for checks to be made on the existing compartmentation and cavity barriers if present in the external or internal of the building. There were quite a number of recommendations within the report to look at these items that assumptions are based on, yes.
What steps, if any, did you take to verify that any amendments to the building satisfied the relevant legislation or guidance?
I didn't take any, like I said, I didn't ask for any certification or completion certificates. Whether they were even available, I don't know.
Right. Would it be normal in your practice to proceed to provide a draft fire safety strategy for an existing building by making assumptions of that nature?
Yes, I think it's reasonable to assume various things.
Well, I didn't ask you whether it was reasonable. I asked you whether it was normal for you.
It's normal if it's reasonable, yes. I mean, one does make assumptions on various things, and that is normal. There was nothing unusual or not normal about the layout of the building.
Right. So the answer to my question is, it was your normal practice to proceed on assumptions such as those without investigating them?
Yes, if I assumed it to be reasonable, yeah. It depends what it was, but yes.
I see. Now, you haven't, I think, anywhere in this introduction identified what the current safety legislation and guidance is. For example, the Building Regulations 2010 or the provisions in the guidance in ADB, Approved Document B. We can see that you haven't done that. Mm-hmm. Can I ask why not?
Because the building is existing, really. So the whole of the construction of the building predates any it predates modern building regulation. And as we discussed earlier this morning, where we have an existing building, just because it doesn't follow the letter of current guidance doesn't make it unsafe, and it's not a gap analysis between the two. It's a bringing together of all that information and a consideration of whether it is safe or not, rather than trying to push something into guidance which is more modern than the building itself.
Okay, I think that's an answer to a different question. Let me just try to get at it a different way, if I can, Ms. Cooney. You frequently refer in this report, and we'll see them in due course, references to current regulatory standards, but you don't identify what they are. And the question is, why don't you do that? Why don't you say building regulations and set out the provision?
They were the current legislative standards. It could have been clearer, I suppose, but I didn't put it in because they were the prevailing standards of the day, I suppose.
I see. And what expertise, experience, or knowledge were you assuming on the part of your reader when referring to current regulatory standards?
As it was a document to inform the design team and essentially our London office, a reasonable level of knowledge.
Right. Now, in the sections which follow this introduction, you see halfway down the page, you give a brief description of the building, and you start with level 1 ground. and you then go up level 2 mezzanine, level 3 walkway deck. Just want to pick up a couple of those. In level 2 mezzanine, do you see? You say in the third sentence, all accommodation on the ground and mezzanine levels are assumed to be under the same management. You see that?
Yes.
And then you say under the next level, level 3 walkway deck, in the fourth line, you say this is assumed to be separated from the firefighting lobby with 2-hour construction and 1-hour fire doors. I take those together, Ms. Cooney, for the sake of speed, but on what basis did you make those assumptions, do you think?
The fact that it was a building run by a large organisation, and having a very substantial residential element to it. So whether or not the accommodation at the lower levels was within the same management organisation that is of the residential areas or not, it would have to meet the higher standard. So we would apply the higher standard of fire safety to it.
Well, maybe, but just so I understand your evidence, are you saying that you assumed, taking the second of those passages I've shown you, that the external stair would be separated from the firefighting lobby with 2-hour construction and 1-hour fire doors because the TMO was a large organisation and the building had a substantial residential element to it? Is that what you're saying is the basis of the assumption?
No.
Well, what is the basis of that assumption?
If I could just read this.
Please do.
I'm not quite sure why you're drawing the two items together. Is that something I could ask for clarification on, please?
Well, I'm just asking what was the factual basis or informational basis on which you made the assumption that you've set out there?
Because the building was over a certain height that would require that level of fire resistance, both under modern day guidance, contemporary guidance as far as I was aware, and the London Act. So you would assume a building of that long-standing nature would have that level of fire resistance. Now, whether that was under the same management or not, you would expect the building to have been built in a robust manner. So
is the answer to the question that you assumed that the building was compliant without further investigation in that respect? In that respect?
Again, I don't think it's it's a reasonable assumption for such a robust constructional method to provide that level of fire resistance.
Ms. Cooney, I'm sorry to be difficult. It may or may not be a reasonable assumption. That's not a matter I'm asking you about. And it's not, with a great respect, a matter for you to tell us about. What I'm after is what happened at the time. And I'm going to ask the question once more. Did, in fact, at the time you assume that the building was compliant in this respect without further investigation?
In respect of its elements of structure, yes, I would, given its construction.
Now, can I ask you to look at page 7, please? You set out 3 purpose groups there. Do you see?
Yes.
Residential, assembly, and offices. I don't think you provide any information there about the characteristics of the occupants under any of those purpose groups, do you?
Could you clarify what you mean by characteristics?
Yes, so I can. So for residential, we don't see any information there, either given or requested or identified as missing, about the characteristics of individual occupants of the residential premises.
That it is inherent in the purpose group. So approved document B breaks buildings down into different purpose groups and applies different levels of various fire safety matters to each purpose group. For example, an office building would be generally assumed to have awake and familiar occupants in it. That is inherent in the purpose group, whereas residential 1A would be flats, where you would expect people to possibly be asleep and be familiar with the building.
Yeah.
So they are inherent in those purpose groups.
Yeah. When you did this report, did you consider specific issues relating to the management of fire safety for people who might need assistance in the event that they had to escape from a fire?
I recall not having really had sufficient information for the lower floors, but for a residential building with a stay-put policy, the place of refuge or the manner of evacuation for all people is to remain in the flat where they'd be given, the design scenario of flats generally, where they would be in a place of safety for a defined period of time.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll come back to stay put shortly. Can we start then with requirement B1, means of warning and escape? This is dealt with on page 8 and following, at paragraph 3.2. You see, and you set out there whether there are adequate facilities for the early warning of fire.
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that in this section you have said that a lot of information is unknown and you've made a number of assumptions, just generally?
There are a number of assumptions, yes.
Yeah, well, let's look at some of them. For example, levels 1 and 2 in paragraph 3.2.1, do you see there? You say that it's unknown whether the community areas and nursery are covered by an automatic fire detection system, AFD, or a manual system triggered by manual call points. You see that?
Yes.
Is that not something that you could have found out?
Yes, and it's information that will probably have informed a further draft. But the fire risk assessment didn't cover those areas, so at that point we didn't have enough information to say yes, it's one thing or another. It is therefore written in that manner. There are areas where there wasn't sufficient information, and we would have expected some feedback from that.
Right. Let's just look a little further down then. Perhaps we could take this quickly. 3.2.3 at level 4. It is unknown whether the office/doctors levels are covered by AFD. Again, this may not have been required. Mm-hmm. See that? Yep. Again, that's something that you could have found out, isn't it?
We could have found out, yes, but again, for the point of which this draft was prepared, and it is only a draft, so there are going to be areas which require further clarification. We didn't have that information at the time, so it's not unusual to have that as a holding statement, if you will, until we have further information.
I see. Just pursuing this further, 3.2.4, individual apartments. All apartments are on the residential floors contain an entrance hallway. It is assumed, you say, that the apartments include smoke detection to at least the protected entrance hall, but it is unknown whether this is a mains-operated AFD. Again, that's something that you could have found out, isn't it?
The risk assessment, as I remember, wasn't particularly clear on this, whether it seemed to be a little bit of a ad hoc provision, and the report does later say to upgrade it if it's not to a current standard. So with matters such as this, where it is a key element of the design, it is brought up later in the report.
These are all matters that you could have found out for yourself, either by a site visit or by asking Mr. Soanes or the TMA before you signed off on this draft and sent it to
Some of the
Dr.
information. Some of the information we could have done, but there was a deadline for the first draft to go out, so that's probably why that information wasn't there at that time.
Right. You haven't identified any of these as matters for the client to verify and bottom out so that they could then come back to you for the next draft. Why is that?
I don't agree with that. There are several recommendations within the report that they actually do check various matters, and if they don't comply, to either upgrade or, we need more information to see what the state of play is with that. So.
Well, I'm talking about these ones, these three. You just leave
Yes.
it on the basis that it's unknown. You don't say these matters need to be verified before a final report is signed off and sent out.
No, I didn't put it in those terms, but in order for this document to move on, they are elements which we would require further information on, and that is detailed further.
We may be able to cut things short then, because I have a number of questions about assumptions. But am I to take it from that answer based on the three examples I've shown you on this page, that where we see it is unknown or it is assumed, those were, in your language, placeholders to be verified by the client so that the final version would have the accurate and up-to-date information in it?
Generally, yes, but I can only give information on. I can only make assumptions if I don't have sufficient information to work from.
And at what stage would that verification and second draft, which would identify these matters, occur?
Usually, typically, normally, whichever word you want, feedback from the design team would advise various matters where there is some uncertainty within a report, and then that would be incorporated in the report, and we would move on to the next iteration until everybody was happy with it. So can we assume that that's the case? Possibly, yeah, without going through them all one by one.
So when you sent this report on the 15th of August to Dr. Barker, why didn't you say to her something like, you'll see that this report contains a huge number of unknowns and assumptions that I've had to make. We need to sort these out with the client before we finalise the report.
It's not. I don't know whether we discussed that afterwards or we didn't. Like I said before, I sat adjacent to Claire, so we did do a lot of communicating just verbally between us. So right. I wouldn't necessarily have put that in writing.
Would that verification process with the client and further draft happen before or after she signed off on your draft?
Typically after, because it's a draft one. So that iteration would go out to the client for their comment and feedback. We would assess that and discuss it, and we'd move on to the next draft. It's not unusual for there to be several drafts before the document is issued.
Right. Can I just ask you to look at something? It's something called PAS 911 of 2007, Fire Strategies, Guidance and Framework for their Formulation. Have you heard of something like that?
I'm not familiar with that particular.
I'll show it to you. It's BSI 00000066. Yes, that's it. I think it's 6 zeros, actually. This is the first page of it, and it is not a British standard. It's a PAS. Mm-hmm. You know the difference between the two.
Publicly available specifications.
Exactly, thank you. And it's promulgated by the BSI and some people called Kingfell. Can I ask you to go to the bottom of page 2, please? You'll see there that it's published in August 2007. Okay. You see? Mm-hmm. Is this a document that you and others at Exova would have used at the time?
No.
It's not?
No.
Okay. If I could just ask you just one or two questions on it then. Page 31, please, which is actually page 37 of the digital, page 31 internally, paragraph 7.1.3. This sets out fire strategies for existing buildings. Do you see? Mm-hmm. And it says, for existing buildings, all the fire strategy inputs given in figure 1, which you don't have to worry about, will be applicable to a greater or lesser extent. Where no other guidance exists, the flow chart given in figure 7 could be followed. And this covers the following, and then it sets out a list of things, including D, site activities. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. For existing buildings, this will incorporate audits and surveys of the building, occupants, services, systems, etc. Mm-hmm. Now, I know you didn't use this guidance at the time within Exova, but would that set out a general principle to which you would adhere when producing an existing fire safety strategy report?
In as far as it is applicable to the scope that we're doing, yes.
Right. And looking at 7.1.3, letter E, first review, so bottom of the page, collation and review of information received with relevant stakeholders. Where the information is found insufficient or ambiguous, further investigations may be required. This may include, for instance, the requirement for system health checks. This would involve one or more meetings with stakeholders. Now, again, I preface the question by recognising that you may not have used this precise policy at the time within Exova, but would that represent a general principle when going about producing an existing fire safety strategy, such as the one you did for Grenfell Tower?
Yes, as a general principle. As a general principle, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, then going on to the report, we can put that away. Go back to the report, please. TMO 10001925, page 8, subsection 3.2.1, levels 1 and 2. You say there, it is unknown whether the community areas and nursery are covered by an AFD. We've looked at that a moment ago. Mm-hmm. Now, it's right, isn't it, that at the time you sent this in draft form to Dr. Barker, the TMO had provided you with the FRA from Carl Stokes. We saw that earlier today.
Yes.
And let's look at that. It's at TMO 100377443, please. And I'd like to take you to page 12. Now, if you go to page 12, you'll see that, let me get to it, there's a box which refers to AFD in the staff kitchen. Do you see that? Sorry, I should point it out. It's the top box. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, top box.
Top box. Second paragraph. There is suitable automatic fire detection in this area to give early warning to a fire situation. Mm-hmm. There is no extraction system in the cooking area. Mm-hmm. You see that? Okay. So when you wrote your report, where you say it's unknown whether the community areas or nursery are covered by an AFD, had you not read this page of the FRA, which refers to an AFD in the staff kitchen?
I will have done.
So can you account for why the report doesn't identify that, or why you say it's unknown whether the community areas and nursery are covered by an AFD?
Well, it only relates to a certain area. I don't know how extensive the automatic fire detection is, what standard it's at.
Right.
So rather than... I mean, it's a partial piece of information. So.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, again, isn't this something that you could have, once the question had arisen, found out for yourself, either by picking up the phone to the TMO or Mr. Soanes, or sending an email, or coming down for a site visit, collating all these unknowns and assumptions, and coming down for a site visit?
Absolutely. We can ask for all of that information. I think. At the time, and again, I keep coming back to this point, it was a draft 1 report, so that the report in and of itself was, as it stood at that particular time. And as I say, there will be bits, areas which can be
Right.
further added to and made clearer, and assumptions can be confirmed. But at that time, I must have felt that there wasn't sufficient information to say that it was, to know what that detection system actually meant.
Did you ask James Lee, when you had access to him, if he had noted on his site visit whether automatic fire alarm and detection was provided?
I do remember speaking about detection in the common areas of the residential areas. There was detection in there. I don't know whether he went into the other areas, whether they were available to him at the time that we attended.
Right. Okay. I mean, going back to the question before last and the answer you gave, it only being a draft, I can understand that it's only a draft, but my question is, did it need to be so draft in circumstances where you could have picked up the phone to the TMO or to Mr. Soanes or done a site visit?
I mean, there's always extra information which you can which you can glean from this kind of point forward. I suppose the question here was that we had a deadline that Studio E wanted some form of a document for, so we did a draft one, and that's specifically why it is, you know, a lot of assumptions.
Yes, I see. Yes, thank you. Going back to your report under 3.2.5, common areas, page 8, you... yes, thank you. You can see there under 3.2.5, common areas, you say an audible fire alarm is not required to common areas of residential buildings. And then you go on to say in the second paragraph, evacuation of flats beyond the dwelling of fire origin would be carried out under the control of the attending fire service if necessary. What guidance were you applying when you made that statement?
It's not specifically guidance.
What would you call it then?
When you have a stay-put policy in a building, it is not typical to have an all-out evacuation. That's the way that these buildings are designed and have been designed for many, many years. So in order to evacuate the building, it's typically the fire service or management, if they have a presence on site, that would initiate a full evacuation.
Were you aware at the time you wrote this that the statutory guidance, so approved document B, required that the building design should be such that there is no reliance on the fire service?
That's what it says in approved document B, and I'm aware of that. But however, if there is the need for an evacuation, then that is typically undertaken by the fire service advice.
I see. So, on what basis then did you make the statement that evacuation of the flats beyond the flat of origin would be carried out under the control of the fire service?
Whilst it is the design of the building doesn't rely on the fire service, if there is one, then that is the way that buildings are evacuated, on the advice of the fire service, or if the management see fit.
Did you give any thought to how the building, as it stood at the time, might support evacuation of the occupants from flats beyond the dwelling of fire origin?
Yes, of course. That is part of the fire safety design of residential buildings, particularly where we have excessive height. The core of the building has a specified fire resistance depending on height. It has the smoke control, which should maintain tenability for that fire scenario, and therefore people who aren't directly on the floor of fire origin should be able to make a evacuation of the building.
Right. We may come back to that when we look at stay put, but coming back up the page to 3.2.3, we looked at the question of whether the office or doctor's levels are covered by AFD. You say it's unknown, and you've explained why you didn't seek to find out. Were you aware of the TMO's statutory obligation under Article 8 of the RRO?
Sorry, I don't know the RRO articles off by heart. Which article are you referring to?
Article 8, to take, well, I'll just give you a little bit of it, to take such general fire precautions as will ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the safety of any of the building owner's employees, the responsible person's employees. You were aware of that?
Yes.
Right. Were you aware of the TMO's duty under Article 13, where necessary, to safeguard the safety of relevant persons? The responsible person must ensure that the premises were, to the extent appropriate, equipped with appropriate firefighting equipment and with fire detectors and alarms. You knew about that?
Yes.
Yes. So having said it's unknown whether those areas are covered by AFD, did you think about how the TMO were going to fulfil their duties as a responsible person under the RRO without providing them with some specific guidance on those matters?
I suppose without further information, it's not something I could have had a firm opinion on. The general fire precautions that are applied to a building under the RRO are bespoke and you know, depending on the building itself. So whilst it may say automatic fire detection, the extent of that varies between buildings. So some buildings may need nothing other than a manual call point system, which is you know, the break glass and a sounder. Then others might need more detection. So when looking at the RRO, it's really a matter of applying it to a specific set of circumstances. So as we didn't know, I haven't specified a category or anything along those lines.
Looking at 3.3.1, please, on page 9, moving on, means of escape. Evacuation principles, you say there. To your knowledge, was there any evacuation strategy that was already in place?
As far as I would be aware, and guided, I suppose, by the fire risk assessment again, and general escape principles for that type of purpose group within the building, you would use a simultaneous evacuation approach.
How did you envisage a simultaneous evacuation approach would be managed?
That falls on the duty falls on the responsible persons for those areas, whether they're tenanted or an ad hoc use of space. It would fall down to the people who are responsible for the people that are in that area.
Indeed, and was it not your thinking at the time that the responsible person would want to be able to use your report in order to inform what evacuation strategy they should adopt?
Yes, in conjunction with the fire risk assessment. I think there's quite a blurry line here between the two document types and purposes. So yes, having that suite of documents, the general escape strategy would advise it, advise the principle for escape.
Your strategy doesn't contain any information or guidance or advice as to how a simultaneous evacuation strategy would be managed, does it?
No, it doesn't. But we wouldn't extend the actual management provisions within a design document. It's again, it's that suite of documents. It's the strategy, the fire risk assessment, and the management documentation held by the responsible persons that would bring together all these parts to be able to run a safe building.
Yeah. You call it a design document, and I note from your evidence this morning that there was an expression you used. Could you just explain to me what you mean exactly when you say design document?
So when buildings are being constructed to ensure fire safety, whether it be a change of any kind of, you know, an alteration to a building or a new building, whatever it may be, there are design parameters which we use ADB for principally to ensure an adequate level of safety. So those matters which are referred to under B1 to B5 of ADB are design parameters. They're not management parameters. They're parameters which, once they've all come together as a design, should be able to be managed effectively. But it doesn't go as far as to say what those management parameters ought to be, as long as it is reasonable to be able to manage that building for that for the design. So that's where the other documents come in.
Yes, I mean, is what you're saying that actually the existing fire safety strategy for this building would be based on an up-to-date fire risk assessment and informed by it, so that your client could have in its hands a single document read either with the up-to-date fire risk assessment, or if one wasn't available, some pointers from you, so as to know exactly whether or not the building was compliant, in what respects it wasn't, and what it should do about it.
As a suite of documents, that's essentially with the existing management strategies and provisions that the organisation holds. Those all come together to do that. Yes.
Right. Okay. Let's move on. Looking at 3.3.2, you discuss occupancy of the boxing club, page 9. 3.3.2. Do you see the second paragraph? Mm-hmm. And you see there in the second paragraph, there you talk about the square footage or meterage of the boxing club and how it's served, and then travel distances to the exit. And you say an additional exit would be required for an occupancy exceeding 60 people. The use of this room is therefore limited by the omission of an alternative escape route. Now that's what you say for the boxing club. Mm-hmm. You don't mention any other calculations of occupancy for any other non-residential parts of the building, do you?
I don't think I do, no.
Why is that?
That's a question which is kind of a little bit fuzzy in my mind, to be honest. I do remember there being some discussion about areas not being in use at that time, and there wasn't... on plan, there weren't large areas. So when you, I think the reason I picked out the boxing club at this point is because it was quite a large floor area, and therefore the ability to have a number of people in there was greater than any of the other areas of the building. So I think that's probably why I've pulled out the boxing club as a and looked at the occupancy of it.
Okay. 3.3.3, just a bit lower down page 9, in the first paragraph there, you identify, I think, contradictory information in respect to the lift landing doors as between the original construction drawings and the existing drawings that were provided. I'm summarising there, but that's right, isn't it?
If I may read the paragraph.
Yes, well, let me take it more simply. First paragraph under 3.3.3, second sentence. There's no access to the stair or lifts in the central core shown on the original construction drawings. However, lift landing doors appear to be shown on the existing drawings provided. See that?
Okay.
Did you attempt to verify which drawings were correct?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to look into that in a bit more detail to actually look at the drawings that I had.
Well, let me ask you this way. Do you remember trying to get to the bottom with somebody of which drawings were correct?
I don't recall, to be honest. There was...
Right.
I don't recall.
Let me just pursue that a little bit. Is that something that you asked James Lee about, do you think?
I can't remember.
No.
I can't remember.
No. Is there any reason why you didn't or couldn't have asked Studio E, or insisted on going down for a site visit in order to sort that out and resolve the contradiction?
Whilst there is a contradiction there, the lift landing doors being shown in the lobby wouldn't have been a non-compliance, for want of a better term. Either with the lift landing doors being shown, it wouldn't have been a concern. It would still have been satisfactory for them to open into the lobby.
But it would have been good to know the answer to the question, though, wouldn't it, before signing off on this?
It would have clarified that sentence, yes, but I don't think it'd have any material difference to the design of the building.
All right. I think it's right that nowhere here, in this part of the report, or in general, do you make any reference to or provide any discussion of the fabric making up the compartment walls?
I seem to recall that there are references to the fabric of the internal walls being masonry.
Well, we'll see how we go, but you don't do it here.
Okay.
Would this not be an appropriate place to identify it?
It's part of the many layers of fire safety within a building, so it fits well in lots of different places, to be honest. But
All right.
it's.
Are you? Sorry, do you want to
Sorry, have you finished?
Sorry, yeah, I'm sure that information is in the document somewhere.
Right. I think it's right, though, that you made no recommendation anywhere in this report for an invasive test or investigation.
No,
No.
no, I don't think I do. No.
No.
Sorry, I do make references to various items being checked, yes, but so in that respect, yes, I made quite a few recommendations on the construction of the building.
Yes.
So.
Looking at the first sentence of the second paragraph, you say, if the accommodation communicates with the firefighting shaft or lift, then the core in this area should be protected to 2 hours fire resistance and 1 hour fire doors.
Mm-hmm.
But just on that, you weren't able to say whether those walls satisfied the requirements for fire resistance unless you knew what the build-up was.
No, we didn't, but I had the information of the original drawings. The information from just looking at the photographs themselves, the thickness of the walls and the general appearance of the walls do look masonry. But again, I'm certain that recommendation is also within the report to check the fire resistance around the cores.
Right. Are you familiar, or were you familiar at the time, with diagram 52 of ADB?
You'll have to remind me what.
Okay. It's CLG 0000173, please, at page 116.
Mm-hmm.
And here it is. It's got A and B, and I'd like to look at A. But I don't think you mentioned diagram 52 anywhere in your existing fire safety strategy, do you?
No.
No. Diagram 52A, just looking at it, makes it clear, or does it make it clear, that a minimum of 120 minutes of fire resistance should be provided to a lobby separating non-residential areas from a firefighting shaft?
From that design, yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That being so, if you could go back to section 333 of your report we were just looking at a moment ago, page 9.
Mm-hmm.
Just go back to that. We may need to have these in parallel, but just go back to that for the moment. If that being so in diagram 52, why do you say in 333 of your report, as there is a single escape route from the building at this level, the exit should be lobbied to provide a minimum of 30 minutes fire-resisting construction, and there should be no combustible materials contained within the entrance lobby? I'm interested in 30 minutes. Why did you say that?
The exit refers to the door rather than So if, going back to diagram 52, the diagram on the right, where we have a firefighting shaft within a residential
Yes.
occupancy, the door between the lobby and the firefighting shaft.
If you could just go back, sorry,
Yep, sorry.
I appreciate you're trying to answer. I'd like to
From
go
it.
back to diagram
Yeah.
52 so that everybody can see what you're referring to. You can
Okay.
just have the whole thing up on the screen. Yes, so
Yeah.
sorry. Do you want to go back and repeat the answer?
Okay, so going back to what you were saying before, if you look at the left-hand drawing,
Yes.
where you have the firefighting shaft and the 60-minute doors, 60-minute fire resistance within the shaft itself, and the 30-minute doors within the so the door that is in the hatch line would be an hour, and the door that's on the internal line would be half an hour, though it's a 1 hour wall.
Oh, I see. I follow. But if you've got accommodation, just looking at any building,
Yes.
and looking at firefighting lobby, you can see the doors on the left-hand side. Those walls should be 120 minutes resistance and 60 minutes.
From the accommodation, yes.
Yes. So if accommodation is behind the doors leading into the firefighting lobby on diagram 52A, they shouldn't be 30 minutes, should they? They should be 60.
For that door, yes, but
Yes.
into the stair would be 30.
And into the stair would be 30. I can see that.
Yeah.
So the question again, you say as there's a single escape route from the building at this level, the exit should be lobbied to provide a minimum of 30 minutes fire-resisting construction.
Could I look at what the reports?
Yes, of course,
office context of where
3.3.3,
we're at?
page 9, please.
Okay. So we're looking here at level 4, which is the office accommodation,
Yes.
isn't it? Yes.
You say in the second sentence, as there is a single escape route from the building at this level, the exit should be lobbied to provide a minimum of 30 minutes fire-resisting construction. I'm really putting to you that it shouldn't be 30, it should be 60.
No, it should be 60. That's quite correct. Yes, that is a mistake. Yeah.
Now, 3.3.4, so just before I leave that, are you accepting that that's an error? And instead
It is
of
an
30?
error, yeah.
Yes,
I
thank you
accept
very
that,
much.
yeah.
3.3.4, page 10, you discuss evacuation principles for the residential accommodation. And look with me, please, at the third bullet point. You say, due to an assumed high degree of compartmentation and therefore a low probability of fire spread beyond the dwelling of fire origin, simultaneous evacuation of the building is unlikely to be considered necessary. See that?
Yes.
Now, I want to look with you at the words, an assumed high degree of compartmentation and therefore a low probability of fire spread. What information did you rely upon to assume a high degree of compartmentation?
The inherent fire resistance within such a robust structure would give you a high degree of compartmentation. There were no, for want of a better term, red flags within the fire risk assessment that showed that compartmentation wasn't as you would expect it to be. And essentially the design of the building being at its time of construction was higher than it would need to be for current regulation. So it is an assumed high degree, but it's a reasonable assumption to make, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you started off that answer by saying the inherent fire resistant within such a robust structure. I understand what that might mean, but my question really is, what investigation did you perform to satisfy yourself that there was an inherent fire resistance within such a robust structure?
Like I've said, we didn't undertake invasive surveys to find out, but we did recommend within the report that it was checked.
So, to be perhaps colloquially looked at it, it was a big 1970s concrete building, and you assumed that it was robust. With the advice to check it, yeah. So it's with the advice to check it. So, first of all, did you cross-reference those assumptions, or that assumption, with Carl Stokes' risk assessment?
I obviously we looked at the fire risk assessment, and the construction and the compartmentation of the building didn't give us any cause for concern.
Right. At paragraph 6.5 of your witness statement, let's just have that up if we can, please. That's EXO 00001590. And I'd like to go to 6.5 at the end of it. You say in the second sentence, a compartmentation survey is a separate piece of work which we were not instructed to carry out. At the time, compartmentation surveys were not commonly undertaken, though in my experience they have become more common since the fire at Grenfell Tower. Mm-hmm. The fact that a compartmentation survey hadn't been carried out, would that not be all the more important a reason for you to carry out some kind of risk assessment, even if just examining the thickness of the walls making up the compartment?
I think that was a matter which obviously we've caveated, and which is for the fire risk assessor to ensure is maintained. The building as it stood was, as you say, a very robust 1970s concrete tower, and there is a great degree of fire protection in that type of construction. So whilst, yes, we say make sure and check, it's not unreasonable to assume that the nature of that construction is going to give you what you require.
I think I'm right in saying that nowhere in your strategy do you advise the reader to verify the assumption or the basis of the assumption that the building contained a high degree of compartmentation.
We didn't ask for it to be verified, no, but again, it goes back to that iterative process of drafts. With hindsight, yes, I could have made a list of I wanted various things, but at the time we went off the information that we had available to us.
Were you aware at the time that the regulatory requirement for the elements of structure comprising compartments in a building such as this was a minimum of 120 minutes of fire resistance?
Yes.
Yes. But that's not something that you put in your strategy. Why is that?
I'm not sure. I would have to take your word for it. I was aware of that, and I'm not concerned with that not being achieved. I think with the events that happened, that's not an unreasonable assumption to have made in hindsight. But I would have to again look at the strategy, see what I actually wrote about the 120 minute requirement. But
okay, let's move on back to your report, please. Can I go back to page 9 and look at the second bullet point under paragraph 3.3.4? I'm so sorry, page 10, 3.3.4, evacuation principles residential. You see that? Mm-hmm. And you say there, in the second bullet point, there is no reliance on rescue for evacuation other than via the main core. You see that?
yes,
What did you mean by that?
that the stair in the building was the only means of escape. So that was the only route vertically through the building. So
Right. How does that statement there relate to your earlier statement at paragraph 3.2.5 on page 8, that evacuation of flats beyond the dwelling of fire origin would be carried out under the control of the attending fire service if necessary? How do those two relate to each other?
well, the principle of the stay-put policy is that the people not within the flat of fire origin should be able to remain within their apartment for a defined period. So it relates to the fact that because of the ventilation provisions within the common area, other people, should they feel the need to leave in that escape time, would be able to use the stair.
Did you ever ask yourself to stand back and ask yourself, well, how, if evacuation of flats beyond the dwelling of origin were to be carried out by the attending fire and rescue service, they would get everybody out down the single staircase comprising the central core?
I didn't stand back from it from a point of view of criticising the prevailing guidance at the time. That's for others to look at, I suppose, the guidance. But that is the standard to which buildings of this nature have been constructed since, in its present format since the mid-80s. So.
I'm so sorry.
So did I stand back and say, is that suitable? I would say then this is the guidance which dictates the design of these buildings. So if it meets with that guidance, then I would deem it to be suitable. I wouldn't necessarily start to base my recommendations on opinions which haven't been ratified by government.
Right. Did it occur to you to think about a situation where if evacuation of the flats beyond the dwelling of origin had to be carried out by the attending LFB, and they had to use the central staircase, that other fire mitigation and protection measures would be needed in order to assist that evacuation?
Not beyond the guidance which is in place to design those buildings.
Right. Going back to the third bullet point on page 10, where we were, well, we've looked at this before, due to an assumed high degree of compartmentation, etc. You say simultaneous evacuation of the building is unlikely to be considered necessary. Were there any conditions or situations in which you contemplated that simultaneous evacuation might be necessary?
Not given the parameters of fire safety design, which is reliant on many provisions kind of interlinking to provide a satisfactory level of fire safety. We don't rely on just a single point of failure. It's a layered approach. So with the robustness of the construction, the ventilation, the compartmentation, principally, the likelihood of a full evacuation is very, very small. So simultaneous evacuation of the entire building has to be because there is a failure of one of those elements, which is negating all the rest of them, really.
Looking at 3.3.6 on the same page, but a little bit lower down, common areas. In the third line, you say the distance to the stairs from the flat entrance doors appears to be more than 7.5 metres from the flats, with the entrance doors to the north of the lift shaft, the maximum of which is approximately 8.3 metres, scaled from microfiche plans, to be checked on site. This excessive distance of less than 1 metre results in an increase in travel of less than 1 second and would be considered to be acceptable under current standards and risk assessment. Okay. Now, you say the distance needed to be checked on site, or was to be checked on site. What guidance were you referring to when you say that the travel distance exceeds 7.5 metres?
Relating to modern day approved document B.
Approved document B, was it? Right. Right. Did you intend to check this yourself or ask that it be checked before this draft was finalised and sent to Dr. Barker?
No, hence why I've asked for it to be checked on site. I believe it was slightly more than that in the, as it turns out, but it was scaled, as I say, from quite grainy drawings.
Indeed, and therefore, who was going to check it on site?
I suppose James could have checked it when he was on site. I don't recall whether I asked him to do that or whether he did. But it's clear that it's something that needed to be checked so that we could put something more in the document.
But sorry, Ms. Cooney, I'm puzzled. You say you suppose James could have checked it when he was on site, but this here says to be checked on site. You're not suggesting that you would ask Mr. Lee to check it?
Not
After
at that time. No. That's the draft.
Now, you know this building is a building with a single stair, and we know from parts of this report we're going to come to in a moment that the smoke control system was unsatisfactory from a modern perspective. You say that in the next section, which we'll come to. In those circumstances, how were you able to justify these excessive travel distances?
Principally because the travel distances were the excess in the travel distance was relatively small, whilst we would design a ventilation system for a certain extract rate or a certain natural pull to today's standards. It would have had some effect, and I think later on in the strategy, I do say that the suitability of the existing system is dependent on how the fans are working for a mechanical shaft at that time, and for that to be checked. But the excess in travel distance under normal design guidance is not unreasonable. It's not something that would cause great concern.
My question is really whether or not, in saying that you could afford the excess travel distance because of the fact that the time increase in travel was less than a second, whether in saying that you were dependent on a fully functioning AOV smoke extract system.
It's part of the package of measures. Yes, I mean when we have a design for a building, we assume that we're going to have some smoke that leaks into the common area as the occupants leave the flat on fire, and that the ventilation system will start to clear that within a reasonable amount of time. Now the excessive travel distance is dependent on that smoke ventilation system working, and because we had limited information on how it all worked, that's why the emphasis on the smoke ventilation checks and design was put in the strategy. So I feel it was brought out in the report quite strongly to check the ventilation.
Well, let's look at smoke ventilation. This is the next section, section 3.4, just at the bottom of page 10.
Mr. Manager, I wonder if the witness might...
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's probably sensible.
Well, if you're going into another part...
I'm just moving on, but yes, it's a different
Would that be a
topic.
good idea?
Yes.
Yes. Ms. Cooney, we'll have a short break now. Again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it while you're out of the room. We'll come back at 3:25, please.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Go to the usher. Right. 25 past, please. Okay. Right, would you ask Mrs. Cooney to come back, please? Right, Ms Cooney, ready to
Okay.
carry on?
Yes,
Good,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ms Cooney, I'm going to ask you one or two questions about the next section, smoke ventilation. Can I ask you please to be shown page 11 of your report?
Thank you.
Okay, and at the bottom there, you, in the penultimate paragraph, say the existing system is unsatisfactory. You see that?
Yes.
From a modern perspective, as the smoke extract shaft was significantly undersized. You see that?
Yes.
And then at the end you say, as the ventilation provision is critical to the stay-in-place evacuation principle, it is strongly recommended that the performance of the automatic system of mechanical ventilation as existing and as proposed is assessed in order to ensure that a satisfactory level of safety is provided to the residents throughout the tower. Now, satisfactory level of safety, what guidance were you relying on to determine what a satisfactory level of safety would be?
Approved document B would be the benchmark document for satisfactory level of safety.
Right. So were you saying that the existing smoke control system in the building was not compliant with modern standards?
I think I'm saying that we don't know enough about it to be able to say that it is, and therefore we would assume it isn't.
Right. Now, in your witness statement, we can look at it if we need to, you say you made a strong recommendation to the effect that you say that it didn't meet current standards, and you said make a strong recommendation in that regard. In fact, your recommendation was no more than the performance of the existing system be assessed.
Yes, the upgrade of the system, I think it says here, the upgrade would not meet the aspiration of achieving current standards, so that's why I made a strong recommendation for it to be looked at.
But you're not recommending here that the smoke ventilation system be brought up to current standards, are you?
No, I'm asking for it to achieve a satisfactory level of safety. So, as a benchmark, again, we go back to approved document B, which would be the current standard.
Wouldn't you need to know whether it was compliant with current standards in order to be able to know whether what was proposed was a material alteration for the purposes of approved document B?
Yes, you would need to know what it is, and I think that's what we asked for. We asked for it to be checked so that we could apply, if you like, the parameters of a material alteration, so that it is a satisfactory level of safety is achieved. Whether that is to modern standards is a matter for the M&E designers, really, but it's a requirement to bring it up so it achieves a satisfactory level of safety.
I mean, given the reliance on compartmentation, on stay put, the single staircase and the excessive travel distances across the lobbies, wasn't it absolutely essential to spell out to the client that they needed to have an upgraded, modern, compliant AOV system, because otherwise the lives of the residents would be at risk?
I think we do spell out that it needs a thorough looking at. We say it is critical to the stay-in-place evacuation principle. I don't think it could be much clearer than that.
Well, a thorough looking at isn't the same as advice to change it out and replace it with something modern and compliant with modern current standards, is it?
It may or it may not be the case. We're looking at something which we haven't got a performance criteria on. So as we don't know what its current state of affairs is, that's why it needs to be looked at. And then obviously if it's not achieving a satisfactory level of safety, then it needs to be remediated. So.
When would this assessment take place? Would it take place prior to your draft becoming a final draft for the client, or at some stage after the final version had gone to the client?
It's part of the part of the draft of the recommendations in the document now. obviously that document, whether it's this draft or the next draft, or when it finally gets to a final issue, the onus is on the responsible persons to be able to carry out those works to achieve that standard.
A little bit above that paragraph, that sentence in this paragraph, it's hard to read because the word draft is smeared all over it. But if you can see it, it says, this also casts into doubt, do you see? Mm-hmm. This also casts into doubt the justification on grounds of escape time, the excessive travel distance as outlined in 3.3.6 above, which we looked at just before the break, Ms. Cooney. So it's clear, isn't it, that the fire safety strategy in draft that you're putting forward is reliant very heavily on the smoke ventilation system to maintain tenable conditions in the building for means of escape purposes.
It is a key component of the fire safety measures in the building. Yes.
Yeah. Why didn't you make that clear in paragraph 3.3.6 itself, which says that which should say, I suggest, that even though excessive distance was acceptable under current standards, you needed to take account of the unsatisfactory condition of the lobby smoke control system?
I think that it is clear in that paragraph that it needs to be assessed and make sure that it does meet a satisfactory level of performance. I don't think that it isn't clear or it isn't strongly enough worded.
Right. Can I ask you, just to confirm with me, you didn't address anywhere in your report stair width, did you?
No.
Nor doors onto escape routes?
Doors onto escape routes. The doors onto the escape routes was part of the core, the consideration of the core materials in the building. So doors, or whether it's a door or wall, it needs to meet a certain level of resistance, and that's...
Yeah. I don't think you did any investigation, you or anybody else at Exova, into the performance of the existing flat doors, stair doors or lift doors anywhere in the building.
No, that wouldn't be typical for what we were doing.
Right. Did you anywhere think to tell the TMO as the ultimate client that they needed to undertake an investigation, and to what standard?
Again, it is one of the recommendations in the strategy, in the draft, to check the core, the fire resistance of the core, and that relates also obviously to doors being part of the building fabric and the walls and the floors, etc.
I don't think you addressed anywhere in your report the lighting of escape routes, did you?
I don't recall it being in the report now.
No. Can I just take you slightly into a siding on this one? Can I ask you to look, please, at CST 0000091, which is Mr. Stokes's record of his significant findings as part of his 29th of December 2010 fire risk assessment.
Okay.
And it's got 5 pages. You see, I think this is a document you didn't read at the time, as you've confirmed earlier.
I've never seen this document.
No.
No.
Can I ask you to go to page 5, please, and look at item 23E on that page? You can see here that Mr. Stokes has given this high priority, hence the red colour in the column, and he identifies the risk under 23E. It is not known if the monthly occupiers' checks are being carried out on the building's emergency lighting system, final exit doors, etc., as per the caretaker's checklist. And then you see the actions to be taken. It should be confirmed with the caretakers if they are carrying out all the monthly occupiers' inspections and other checklists as per the caretaker's checklist. You see that?
Okay, yeah.
And in the same... yeah, if you also look at the FRA, if we can just go to that, there's a reference to emergency lighting in that. If you go to page 17, please, in the FRA, I'm so sorry, FRA, that's TMO 100377743. TMO 100377743 at page 17. If you look at item 15, emergency escape lighting, he's ticked yes, 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 yes under each of those items. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
unless you had read that part of the FRA alongside the record of significant findings, you wouldn't have known, would you, that the emergency lighting wasn't being maintained monthly?
No, I wouldn't know whether the checks were being undertaken, no.
And it would have been helpful to know that in order to be able to advise the TMO, wouldn't it? Under your strategy.
Whether it's being checked or not is a management type of provision. So that the managing team should carry out these checks. In terms of the design of the building, and the expectation would be that it met a certain design criteria, which is noted here on under comments and observations.
Lighting of escape routes is one of those things that is that there is guidance in respect of under B1, isn't there?
Yes.
Yes. Similarly, exit signs?
Yes, exit signs is under there, yes.
Evacuation lifts?
Evacuation lifts aren't a required feature for buildings.
Right. And yet you haven't, I think, covered in your report either lighting of escape routes or exit signs.
I don't recall it being in there, no, it's not.
Right. And why is that?
I don't know, if I'm perfectly frank. It's, again, an area of the report which needs further information into it as a draft. But certainly it would be a key component of B1.
Now, can I just ask you then about Section 5, moving on to that, please, in your report. If you go back to that TMO 1000192, page 13, and look, please, at paragraph 5.1.3, I just want to ask you about fire stopping. If you go to that. (5.1.3) fire stopping within concealed spaces. You see that? Yes. And you say in the first sentence under this heading, in the second paragraph, well, before I go to that, actually, there's a quotation. The building shall be designed and constructed so that unseen spread of sorry, I'll start again. The building shall be designed and constructed so that unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited. And that's a quotation, isn't it, from B3,
yes.
4, in fact. And then you say there are limits to the extent to which any cavities can exist, for example, between walls and cladding and between ceilings and roofs. Okay. And then you go on to say fire stopping via appropriate cavity barriers are assumed to be in place. You see that?
Yes.
Did you understand that there was a difference between cavity barriers and fire stops?
Yes, there is a difference.
And what was that difference?
So, ostensibly, it's the difference between a fire-resisting element and a compartment line. A compartment being a more robust element of fire resistance.
Yes. I see. Would you say that you went about fire stopping with a cavity barrier?
It really depends on the location of what it is that is being stopped, or a barrier, a cavity barrier. You know, the different areas need different. It might need a fire stopper. It might need a cavity barrier. When we refer to fire stopping, it's not necessarily meaning fire stopping on a compartment line. It means a material which is preventing the spread of fire between through an element, which may only be a cavity barrier or a fire resisting wall for means of escape purposes or an element of structure. There's various uses of the words, really.
Well, let's see if we can make this shorter. Go to CLG 0000173 at page 144. This is ADB. And these are the definitions used in ADB. Appendix E, page 144. And look with me, please, at the definition of fire stop, which is on the right-hand side, second from the end. You see that? And it's a seal provided to close an imperfection of fit or design tolerance between elements or components to restrict the passage of fire and smoke. You see that?
Okay.
Did you understand that that was the definition of fire stop at the time?
Yes.
And then if you go on to page, or back rather, to page 143, please. Back to page 143, you see the definition of cavity barrier. I've done it in this order deliberately. At the bottom of that page on the left-hand side, cavity barrier, a construction other than a smoke curtain provided to close a concealed space against penetration of smoke or flame, or provided to restrict the movement of smoke or flame within such a space. Now, given those are two clear and distinct, well, I should ask you, are those two clear and distinct definitions of two different things?
They are, but without wanting to be, you can have a penetration through a cavity barrier, for example, above a fire-resisting door set, which then needs to be fire stopped with a fire-stopping product.
Yes.
So whilst they are two distinct definitions, we can use the word fire stop for a generic manner of sealing penetrations through fire-resisting elements.
And I wonder if you could just go back to page 13 of your report in section 5.1.3, TMO 1000125, page 13, when you say that fire stopping via appropriate cavity barriers, when you say that there, aren't you mixing up terminology dealing with the separate aspects of approved document B?
It could be clearer. I would admit it could be clearer, but the context and the general understanding is clear. There's a hole in a fire-resisting element. It needs to be fire stopped.
But if the reader of your well, let me ask you this. What assumptions were you making about the familiarity that the reader of your report had with approved document B?
I would, like I've said before, for the reader of this particular draft, I was expecting this to go through to the design team and those in the team undertaking the next set of documents to be fairly knowledgeable about fire-related matters.
Did you expect the reader of this report, the ultimate end user, as you referred to them earlier, to be more expert on ADB, as expert on ADB, or less expert on ADB than you?
Less, I would assume. Yeah.
And given that you were expecting them to be less expert on ADB than you, wouldn't the expression fire stopping via appropriate cavity barriers muddle them up and get them to think that one could fire stop with cavity barriers?
I suppose it can be read that way. I don't think it's necessarily a, like I said, it could be clearer.
But unless you knew the difference in definitions, and perhaps the acceptance to the difference in definitions that you've identified, you would think, wouldn't you, that you would fire stop with a cavity barrier?
If the cavity barrier has, so cavity barriers, whilst there is a certain understanding of a requirement, the cavity barrier can have various fire resistances and various uses. Cavity barriers are prolific throughout buildings internally and externally. So, like I say, yes, it could be clearer, but I don't think the intention is to necessarily confuse.
Where in the building did you think that appropriate cavity barriers were in place?
So the prime places for cavity barriers are in excessive voids and to the external facade. The over various internal door sets and down corridors, they can be anywhere in a building that requires fire resisting. Really, there's if it needs a cavity barrier to extend an element of fire resistance, for example, a protected corridor or something along those lines within the non-residential areas.
I mean, on the basis of your familiarity, such as it was with this building, where within the building did you think cavity barriers were in place, according to the assumption you were making?
I didn't know where the cavity barriers were, which is, I suppose the reason for the recommendation. But they can be, anywhere in the building. So it would be anywhere above a suspended ceiling, for example, or again in external facades or the lobbies within the accommodation, places such as that.
You go on in the last sentence to say that it's recommended that these elements are assessed within void flats to a level which would provide confidence in whether or not the provision is satisfactory.
Mm-hmm.
By what performance criteria were you telling or advising the ultimate end user of this report
Well, within
to measure satisfactoriness?
Within the whole fire stopping section, what was being looked for there was basically penetrations and holes within the fabric between the enclosing walls of the flats internally and the adjacent spaces or flats.
Yes. By what standard were you advising the reader of this report to judge whether the provision was satisfactory or not?
It doesn't state it there.
It doesn't?
It doesn't, no.
No. It should have done, shouldn't it?
Again, fire stopping comes in different periods of fire resistance, so it could have been clarified there, but typically it can be throughout the building, so yes, it would have been a good place to put that.
Let's move very quickly into external fire spread. Very quickly, you go please to page 14 of this report, section 6, and you set out there the requirement of B4 at the top, and the general philosophy, and the external wall construction. And just to be clear on that, we have no complaint about that. My question is, you didn't have anything in there about the external fire spread requirements on the in respect of the roof. We can see that it wasn't there. Why was that?
I don't think we had any information on the roof at that particular time, but I could have had a holding spot.
There's no holding spot in respect of it. Does that mean you didn't consider the roof at all?
I would have considered the roof. Obviously, there's not a reason for concern on it, so I haven't put that holding spot in there.
Right. And just to be clear, although you haven't set out the basis on which, under 6.2, you said that the external surface over 18 metres should have a surface classification of class 0 national or B, etc., European. That's ADB, isn't it, clearly?
Yes.
Diagram 40. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And the question is, why didn't you just set out that it was diagram 40 so that the reader would know that it was anchored in the regulation?
It's it wasn't common practice to replicate all of these parts of approved document B and import various diagrams into a draft report, really.
Right. Can I take you to section 7, B5, access and facilities for the fire service, page 15. I just want to look at two short provisions, 7.1 and 7.3. Under 7.1, you say in the second line there should be a dry rising main within the firefighting shaft. You see that?
Yes.
And to be fair to you, I think your point here is that the outlet should be in the stair and not in the lobby, but that's an existing condition. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I just want to focus on your advice that it should be a dry rising main. Look at 7.3. If you look there, you say that the current guidance, do you see in that paragraph, 4 lines up from the bottom, should be for a wet rising main. You see that? Because the building's over 50 metres in height, yes?
Yes.
Was this not contradictory advice, dry rising in 7.1 and wet rising in 7.3?
I don't think so, no. I think so Section 20 of the London Act asked for a main, and it would have needed a wet riser. For whatever reason, we have a dry riser in an existing building. So in terms of the existing provision, it is satisfactory based on having a single fire scenario, a flat on fire, given the heavy level of construction fabric and compartmentation. I didn't think that the dry riser would be a significant reduction in standard over the wet for this type of a building, given that there was no works being carried out on those levels as I understood it at the time.
Right. Just try that one again. You say there should be a dry rising main, and then you say there should be a wet rising main. I mean, which is it?
The current guidance would say that there's a wet rising main, but we have a dry rising main, and I go on to say that given the provisions in the building, that should be satisfactory.
You say in the sentence beforehand in 7.3, the fire risk assessment describes the provision of a firefighting shaft and firefighting evacuation lifts with dry rising main. You see that?
Yes.
If you go to to 7.1, you say the building should be provided with a firefighting shaft, and then you say one is provided. You see that?
Sorry, 7.1.
Yes, 7.1 at the very top of the page.
Yes. Yeah.
You say one is provided, as stated in the current fire risk assessment. Was that a reference to Carl Stokes' 29th of December FRA?
Yes.
Well, we've looked at the then current fire risk assessment from the 29th of December 2010. We can't find any reference to the tower being provided with a firefighting shaft. I'm not going to sit here and comb through it with you. There isn't time. But do you remember taking any steps to verify that the fire risk assessment did actually say what you say it says?
Having a 2-hour stair, dry rising main, fire evacuation lift, they are the key component parts of a firefighting shaft.
Right. Did you take any steps to check that it was correct with regard to the provision of a firefighting shaft?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Did you check the fire risk assessment?
The fire risk assessment noted these component parts which are integral to a firefighting shaft. So together they would form the shaft itself. With a residential building, which I hope we can come back onto later to pick up another point from before, but that the constituent parts of a firefighting shaft are the stairs, the lift, and the lobby approach and the firefighting main, whether that be wet or dry.
Yeah. What you're summarising just now is the essence of what diagram 52, I think, shows.
It is a firefighting shaft, yes. Yeah.
Now, you say in 7.1 that the fire main outlet should be sited in the stair.
Yes.
You don't refer to diagram 52, but we looked at that. We know that the fire main outlets were in the lobbies, and that's an existing condition. We've just been through that. Why did you not include any discussion or assessment within your draft report about the impact of the operation or on the operation of firefighting on the fact that the fire main outlets were in the lobbies and not in the stair as required by diagram 52?
The outlets being in the lobby, and I'm fairly sure on this, were a requirement of Section 20 at the time. Terry's probably your man to clarify that for you, but the Section 20 asks for it to be in the protected lobby rather than in the stair, so that's probably why it was originally constructed in that manner. And as an existing condition of a provision that was put in specifically under firefighting legislation,
Yeah.
it was considered to be satisfactory.
Yes, that wasn't my question. My question wasn't about compliance. My question was about the absence of any discussion or assessment in your report about the impact of the fire main outlet being in the lobby as opposed to the stair and its potential impact on firefighting operations. Now, you don't mention anything in your report about that. And my question is, why didn't you do that?
We didn't do an assessment on it in terms of outlining how we came to that conclusion. But that process has been gone through and come to the conclusion. We didn't, I suppose I didn't feel it necessary to put it in if I'm ultimately going to say it's satisfactory.
So, because the ultimate reader of this report wouldn't know that having the fire main outlets in the lobbies as opposed to in the stair, as required by approved document B, diagram 52, would have an impact on firefighting operations.
But then we are trying to push an existing building and its fire safety provisions into a current guidance document, which is somewhat of a gap analysis, as we were discussing before, and that's not always necessary. So it doesn't make it unsafe. It's an existing provision under what was still then current legislative guidance, I guess.
Right.
So
Firefighting lift, you deal at paragraph 7.3 on page 15 in the fourth line with that, and you say the fire risk assessment describes the provision of a firefighting shaft and firefighting stroke evacuation lifts with dry rising main. We looked at that before. You see that? Mm-hmm. Can I ask you to look at Mr. Stokes' December 2010 fire risk assessment, TMO 100377743 at page 4. And just to remind you, you got this on the 13th of August 2012. Okay. Page 4, please. And this is at the bottom of that page, and it says, as you see, in the bottom box under use and layout of the building, 4 lines up, the entrance lobby has 2 lifts which service all the floor levels, both of evacuation stroke firefighting lifts, so can be used for disabled evacuation if needed. You see that?
yes.
And then it goes on, please see the attached plan. Showing the layout.
Okay.
And a little bit higher up the page, 3/4 of the way through the big box, just before the last paragraph break, Mr. Stokes says the 2 lifts in the building are both firefighter evacuation lifts. Both of the lifts serve each floor level and run the height of the building. You see that?
Yes.
Now, you recall I showed you this earlier. You had asked Bruce Soanes on the 9th of August whether the lifts were firefighting lifts, hadn't you?
I had, yes.
And he had responded to you on the 10th of August saying no firefighting lift. Remember that?
I do.
We looked at it this morning. And then you went back to him the same day saying, thanks, Bruce, that all makes sense within the context of the existing building. You remember I showed you that?
Yes.
You can look at that again if you like, but you remember that? Okay.
Yes.
Now, my question is this. Once you saw the December 2010 fire risk assessment on the 13th of August, a few days after you'd responded to Mr. Soanes, did you notice that it contradicted what Mr. Soanes had told you a few days before in this respect?
Yes, I did notice a contradiction at that time.
You did. Did you go back to Mr. Soanes and ask him why he had said that there was no firefighting lift, when in fact the FRA said there was?
I don't recall whether I did.
We don't have a record of you doing so, and you don't
No.
cover it in your statement, and I don't think he covers it in his statement. So,
I don't recall doing so, but as the fire professional, I suppose I took a judgment on the fact that Mr. Stokes's fire risk assessment is littered with this information, and it being a regulatory document, the lifts are clearly noted throughout the document. So, given the difficulty that I'd had getting information out of Studio E, because they didn't seem to have very much on the existing building, this was a more reliable source.
well, you say it was a more reliable source. You'd actually asked Mr. Soames the question. He'd given you a clear answer, so there was now a conflict, as far as you could see, between what Mr. Soames had told you and what the FRA had said. So my question is, why didn't you simply send him an email or pick up the phone to him and ask him, well, I've got the FRA. It says there are these firefighting lifts. Why do you say there weren't? And resolve the conflict in some way.
I don't have an answer for that. I don't know whether I did discuss that with him or I didn't. I just simply can't recall whether I did.
Can I suggest an answer, and please tell me if this is wrong? You were very short of time.
Well, we were short of time, yes, in terms of the deadline which Studio E wanted the draft document for. But I don't think that's necessarily why I didn't. I genuinely can't recall whether I did or I didn't.
Did you think to sort the issue out with anyone from the TMO?
No, I don't recall having any contact with the TMO.
Did you know that, as it turns out, the lifts were not firefighting lifts?
I learnt that post-fire, yes.
So opting not to sort out the issue, but opting instead simply to go on what Mr. Stokes had said, do you accept turns out to be a serious error in your work?
I think that the reliance on the fire risk assessment, which, like I say, is a regulatory document, is a reasonable thing to do in this set of circumstances. And given that it was, it was a draft document, that is there to be challenged by the design team. So, whilst as it transpired not to be the case, that was the information I was given and was reliant upon at that time.
Well, you'd had two conflicting sources of information: your instructing architect and the FRA.
Mm-hmm.
And so, why was the FRA any of the more reliable than your instructing architect?
Well, you would assume the regulatory reform order requires a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, and the presence of firefighting lifts, and indeed it says evacuation lifts, is throughout the document.
Now, on page 16 of your draft report, you set out your conclusions and recommendations.
Yes.
You identified 3 items that you say have significant consequences in the event of a fire for the means of escape and potential for breaches in compartmentation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't identify who is responsible for investigating those matters. Why is that?
From a point of view of this document, it would be going back to the design team. So these items will be picked up by the design team and investigated.
By the design team, you mean Studio E, do you?
And the larger team, yes. So
who's the larger team?
So in terms of the mechanical elements, it'd be the people who were looking at the ventilation, etc., etc.
Right. And you don't identify a time frame within which the investigations you've identified should be carried out. Why was that?
Again, it's a draft document, so it's really for this document is a draft for discussion, if you will. So we rely on feedback to be able to move the document forward.
Right, I see. How long would it normally have taken you to prepare a final draft, client-ready, for a fire strategy for an existing building such as Grenfell Tower? A
number of weeks. steadily, solidly for a good number of weeks, I would have thought. If it was to meet all the requirements.
Right. Just to be clear, how long would it take you normally to prepare a first draft?
Again, it's dependent on the amount of information we have.
Right. Okay. Can I ask you
to a week, I suppose?
I'm sorry, I cut across your answer.
Sorry, anything up to a week, a few days to a week, depending on the information we have.
Okay. Can I ask you to be shown, please, the native version of EXO 00001353, the native version. And this, Ms. Cooney, is a spreadsheet which has been disclosed by Exova showing the time you spent on this report.
Mm-hmm.
So just look at it with me. I don't know if you've ever seen this document before. Would it be familiar to you?
I understand it, but I don't think I've seen it.
All right. If you look at it under rows 49 to 52, I'm afraid you're going to have to go to those timesheets and then look at 49 to 52. Yeah. Now you can see 49 to 52. We just there we go. This is fire strategy for existing condition. Cate Cooney. And if you look at column E. Row 49, 9th of August 2012, plans appraisal, and then we have further dates, 10th of August, 13th of August, 15th of August.
Okay.
Now, it went out to Dr. Barker on the 15th of August, and therefore, am I right in thinking that all the times between the 9th and the 15th were spent working on this draft?
Yes.
Right, so adding up those hours, we get 2, 6, 1, and 6, which by even my maths, I think I get to 15. Yes, so can we take it from this document that you spent 15 hours working on and producing this draft that you sent to Dr. Barker?
Yes, from that timesheet, which I may have spent more time on than that, but yes, that's what I've booked down to it.
Right. Would that be a normal period of time to spend on a document like this?
For a draft, it's essentially the best part of 3 days. So, yes, it's for a first draft of this kind of with this kind of information where there's a lot of caveats, I think it's not unusual. I don't think.
Right. So you said earlier on, in answer to an earlier question I asked you, how long it would take to prepare a first draft, and you said it would depend on the amount of information. You would say anything up to a week, depending on the information. 15 hours isn't anything like a week, is it?
It's half a week, really, in terms of the way that we booked time, which was based on essentially, right. If you worked all day on it, you typically book 6 hours down to it.
I mean, to be blunt about it, it's not very long, is it?
Well, it's quite an intensive piece of work. You are working at it all day long. It's really a matter of gathering all the evidence, which isn't. I don't think it's really accurately reflected in those hourly figures. And again, knowing what I know in terms of producing works to a standard that we can call it a draft. We might work more hours than that, but log less depending on fees and other things going on at the time. So whilst it's a good indicator, it's not necessarily 100% of the time that you've spent.
And can I ask you to look at EXO 0000302, which is an invoice of the 27th of September 2012. and this is sent to the TMO, and you can see that it's dated the 27th of September, and what is billed here is a fixed lump sum fee for £2,865. That's the quote we saw in the fee proposal. Cumulative to date was £2,111.50. You see that?
Yes.
And that meant that something like £753 remained to be invoiced from the lump sum fee quoted in the fee proposal. Why did Exova invoice less than originally quoted?
I don't know. I wouldn't have been responsible for instructing the invoice.
Given that the report had not progressed at this point beyond the draft stage, would it be normal for Exova to invoice at that point?
Yes, the typical invoicing period was at the end of each month.
Right. Given that this was a draft, was the balance of the fee to be invoiced once the draft was turned into a final document and sent to the client?
Not necessarily, no. It depends. Some jobs you'd use a fee quite quickly. Other jobs, there would be lots of fee there. It's really a matter of managing your workload. It's not necessarily an absolutely, to the quarter of hour logging system. There's an awful lot of work that doesn't actually. It's a lump sum fee, so you do the work regardless of what the fee is.
With the fact that only £753 remained outstanding to be done, would that indicate that the vast majority of the work had been done?
I think the majority of setting out the report had been done, but there's obviously more information to follow.
Yes. Okay, I'd like to turn next, please, to the review done by Dr. Barker. A couple of preliminary questions. I think these are really yes or no answers as far as you can recall. Is Exova, or was Exova at the time, certified under ISO 9001?
I don't know.
You don't know. Now, at paragraph 3.8 of your witness statement, if we could please go back to that at page 3, you say that the peer review process at Exova, you see that? 3.8. The peer review process at Exova is part of the document quality control and typically involves someone of equal or greater seniority to the drafter reviewing the report to ensure that there are no clear errors and that it is sound in basis. It was Claire Barker, I think, who reviewed your report, didn't she?
Yes.
Dr. Barker.
Yes.
And if we look at what she said, it's EXO 50175. This should be a pair of emails, one from you to her and one from her to you. Yours on the 15th of August, second email down, 15:37 to Dr. Barker. Claire, please can you review the existing FSS for the above? I've printed out the drawings. If these help, they probably will. And she responds at 15:22, just under exactly 24 hours later, on the next day, 16th of August, have reviewed it and it is fine. You see that?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you and she have any actual discussion about your draft, or was her statement that it was fine, quotes unquotes, the extent of any discussion between you at that time?
It's very probable, though I don't recall any specifics of any conversation. But it is probable she's asked questions about it.
Her comment, I've reviewed it and it was fine. Is it usual, or was it usual, for you to receive so little detail from a peer review of such a report?
It depends on the job and what it entails, really. It wasn't unheard of not to have any substantive comments back for that's why I'm saying that it's probable we discussed it between us. So yes, I mean, sometimes they came back with comments and sometimes they didn't. It depended.
Would you usually expect some kind of feedback as part of the peer review process?
Yes, if there are questions that have been raised, then they're not straightforward, or you need to put some more information to them to put it in context, then a peer reviewer will ask you questions, and if they don't need to, then they won't. It's really is dependent on the job.
And normally, how long would a peer review on average take before coming back to you with a peer review report on your work?
Again, it's down to workload. But if you're reading through it, it may take a couple of hours or so to review a report. The report was quite short, so I would have thought that Claire would have read it fairly quickly, maybe an hour or so. I don't know. You'd have to ask Claire.
So you don't know how long she spent reviewing your draft during the 24 hours that elapsed between you sending it to her?
No, I don't.
Did you send her any other documentation that you had reviewed in order to prepare your draft, other than the report you sent her?
And the drawings.
And the drawings?
I think Claire had obviously the same amount of information I had from the beginning, so she may well have referred to those.
Did you send her the Stokes FRA and the email correspondence that you'd had with Mr. Soames?
I don't think I would have sent those documents. I would have had them printed out somewhere and probably just put them on a desk.
Put them on whose desk?
On Claire's desk.
Right.
That was fairly typical.
Did you alert her to the need to read them, or did you not?
I can't recall it. Again, it might have been a conversation we had.
Okay. You then say in your statement at paragraph 3.10, after the peer review, reports are then sent to our administration team to produce in final form. They're still marked draft until approved by the regulator or client before being circulated. Mm-hmm. This was clearly intended to be sent to Studio E as a draft, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was it ever sent to Studio E or the TMO for approval?
Yes, I sent it through to Studio E via email.
You sent it to Studio E?
Mm-hmm.
Would you then have followed up to make sure that a final version was sent to the client?
For this particular project, because I was undertaking the draft strategy on behalf of the London office, then not necessarily. That the project was being managed in London. So.
Now, we know from your statement that the version which we've looked at, the 16th of August draft, marked draft, is the only version of the existing fire safety strategy report ever created. Do you know why it was never finalised?
I don't know.
Was it usual for drafts not to be finalised?
No, not to this extent, no. Typically we would get some detail back from the design team and it would be updated.
Did you never discuss the assumptions and unknowns in it so that a final draft could be produced?
With Studio E or with?
Well, at all.
I discussed the assumptions. I must have discussed the assumptions with Claire because I don't recall it in the time frame, but I do know that Studio A did come back with some comments on it. So I don't know whether they were ever then followed through to produce another document. I was never requested to produce any further documentation on it.
Well, let's just chase this through. Could you please be shown TMO 1000, I'm so sorry, EXO 00001396. This is your email sending draft 1, which is this draft, through to Mr. Soames on the 16th of August. Okay. You see, you say, Bruce, please find attached draft 1 of the existing fire strategy for the tower. I'll be finishing to go on holiday on Friday. Please feel free to ring and discuss any of the content before then. Mm-hmm. Now, 16th of August was a Thursday, I've checked. So, in fact, you were going on holiday the very next day, weren't you?
Okay.
Would you remember that?
I don't remember the specific dates I went on holiday.
Okay.
Yes.
So you gave him at best 24 hours to review it and discuss it with you, didn't you?
Well, to discuss it with me personally, yes, but he
Indeed.
obviously could have discussed it with others.
All right. Can you go forward then in time and a different document, SEA 506048. SEA 6048. This is an email from Mr. Soanes to Mr. Ashton at Exova, copied to Claire Barker and Paul Dunkerton. Terry, we have a meeting planned for the afternoon. You see that?
Yes.
Of the 6th, which is the date Kate returns, bounce back below, and you can see the bounce back at the very bottom of the page. You see, I'm currently on annual leave and will not return until Thursday, the 6th September 2012.
Okay.
And then he says this: she did offer to have someone come back with a markup of the plans forwarded 16th of August, but we haven't received one yet.
Okay.
These have been developed as part of the preparations for the planning submission, etc. We need to go through the fire strategy existing draft received 16th of August, which has numerous recommendations, some of which may be unrealistic for an interim strategy. It is probably also a good time to make contact with the local fire officer to discuss the project. You see that?
Yes.
When did you offer Mr. Soanes someone to come back with a markup of the plans?
I think the markup of the plans is relating to the layouts of the lower floors we looked at before.
Right. Do you recall a discussion with Mr. Soanes about that topic on the Friday morning of the 17th of August, before you went on holiday?
I don't recall the conversation, no.
Do you know if there was ever a going through of the fire strategy?
I don't.
Was it ever followed up with you?
No, it went back to, obviously, to others. So.
Were you ever asked to discuss your recommendations, assumptions, or other things you'd left outstanding with anybody?
No, no.
Did it not occur to you to find out from Dr. Barker or Mr. Soanes why that was and chase it up after you got back from holiday?
No, because it was handed back to colleagues who were dealing with the project overall.
Did Mr. Ashton ever tell you or invite you to comment on the idea that a detailed interrogation of the draft fire strategy was required once you'd got back from holiday?
No, I don't recall, Terry.
Right. Do you know if Exova ever made any efforts to understand the draft strategy that you'd provided in any detail?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Yes. Did anybody ever ask you, I'll try it differently, to help Exova understand the existing situation and the draft fire strategy that you'd produced?
After I sent the email to Bruce, and once I had commented on the proposals, I didn't have any further involvement with the project, so right. No.
Do you remember having a discussion with Mr. Soanes on the morning of the 17th of August?
I don't.
You don't?
I don't.
Now, I'm going to go back to an email we looked at earlier today, the email of the 17th of August 2012 at EXO 00001279. This is your email to Andrew Martin. You remember we looked at this before?
I do.
It's the one with the colourful language.
Yes.
I'm not going to read it all out to you, but I take it you're familiar with it.
I am. Yeah.
Yes. What was your purpose in sending this email?
The purpose was to basically advise Andy that if somebody was to ring in relation to the project, kind of an outline of what it was about, really. But as far as I know, Bruce never called, and Andy didn't reply to it. So it's just an internal email to a colleague. Yes, it has colourful language, but it was never intended for anybody but Andy, really.
Well, I understand that. Mm-hmm. You say they are now adding additional levels, which merges around a single stair. Not great. You see that?
Yes.
Did you explain your view about that to Mr. Soanes when you spoke to him?
This email, as I stated before, doesn't. So this is in relation to the refurbishment, an early design proposal. So I didn't speak to Bruce about the markups at all, because I sent them through to Terry. I don't think I can't recall speaking to Bruce, but
Right. You say, basically, I've told him we can massage the proposal to something acceptable with separation, lobbies, etc., but there are approval risks to the project on the FF shaft stroke MOE, means of escape, front. Were you suggesting to Mr. Soanes that you could do something to get around the problem posed by building control, being otherwise likely to reject the smoke, ventilation, and other proposals for the building?
absolutely, categorically not.
So what do you mean? So sorry.
So in the use of massage, which yes, it's a word I could have used several other words, but what I intended by that is then followed on with separation lobbies. What it essentially means is design changes, which would improve the layout from a fire safety perspective. So that's all that was intended by that.
I see. You go on to say jumping ahead, paragraph 3 of your statement, you say that what you meant in that sentence was that with some design changes, the proposal could be improved to a level where they would be satisfactory from a building regulations perspective. That's what you meant, is it?
Design changes to make it work essentially from a fire safety design point of view, yes.
That's not what massaging normally means, is it?
It has several meanings, and as I've already said, yes, I could have chose a different word. It didn't. There's no intention to be anything other than just design change in it, and that is all I meant by it. Yes,
what I'm really suggesting to you is that the use of the word massage was really a deliberate one, because what you were seeking to do was really just to present matters in a different way so as to get it past building control.
Absolutely.
And not to make any substantive changes to the design.
Absolutely.
You reject that, do you?
I absolutely reject that.
You absolutely
yes,
reject it.
Absolutely.
You say in the email we can massage the proposal to something acceptable. Acceptable to whom?
Something acceptable in general terms, really. The proposed design, as I remember it, was, as I say, it wasn't great. It took residents out of the single stair back through the building, which we wouldn't allow to happen without further measures being in place.
Did you ever discuss your concern about merging of uses around a single stair with Mr. Ashton? Do you remember?
I think I did, because it was Terry that asked me to look at that that layout, as I recall.
And then you go on to say, in the penultimate sentence, they are making an existing crap condition worse, so it's a matter of working the worst bits out and making the new stuff work. You see that?
Yes.
What did you mean exactly by making an existing crap condition worse?
From my understanding of the original layout, there were some non-residential areas off the single stair, which under modern day guidance wouldn't be what we would ideally be looking for. So to in fact negate the risk from those, we needed to introduce new measures to improve that situation. So whilst it was an existing condition, I suppose this is where you kind of try to improve on an existing condition when relevant works are being carried out.
In what respects did the proposed refurbishment make the condition of the building as regards compliance with the building regulations worse?
From a point of view that they were adding additional flats to the building. They were changing the escape routes for the residents, so it was a way of making sure that where, as I said before, the residents would come out of the single stair and through the building to make sure that those new provisions were making it less satisfactory.
And what were the worst bits or worst bits?
I didn't like the non-lobbied approach that they had to other purpose groups. So
Right. Was this a conversation you had with Mr. Soanes? Did you say to Mr. Soanes that he was making a crap condition worse? So it's a matter of working the worst bits out and making the new stuff work.
no, this was an internal email to Andy, and at that particular time, there had been nothing concrete that had gone back to him, as far as I know. I'd been asked to provide some thoughts on a design, and that was just really to say to Andy that it's not where it needs to be.
Did you ever communicate to Mr. Soanes the gist of your concern that
I
you've
didn't.
expressed colourfully here?
I didn't speak, to my recollection, I didn't speak to Mr. Soanes once I went on holiday. I can't
Right.
recall.
The only reason I ask you is because you say in the first part of the paragraph, I've just spoken to Bruce in relation to the attached.
Okay.
So in the just speaking to Bruce, did you tell him words to the effect of they're making an existing crap condition worse?
I wouldn't have used that term.
I know that, but the gist of it.
With Bruce, but I can't recall the detail of the conversation with Bruce at all. I don't remember the conversation in any detail. If there was a likely the way I would have told him is that there are approval risks, and it needs to be, we need to look at separations, lobbies, things like that to try and make the proposal work. But I don't recall specifics of the conversation with him.
Right. And then you say at the end of that paragraph, LABC Building Control, Kensington and Chelsea, do we have any contacts there?
Mm-hmm.
Did you in fact have any contacts within RBKC's Building Control Department in relation to this project?
I didn't know.
What was the purpose of asking the question?
The purpose of asking the question really is so it's very normal to engage with building control as soon as you can to get their opinion and involve them in the project, so that if there is anything that they have concerns over, that we can at that stage incorporate those into the design, so that once the design reaches a finalised stage, that we're all happy that it achieves what it needs to achieve.
Mr. Chairman, it's gone 4:30.
Well, I noticed that.
And I noticed you noticing it. I am pretty much at the end of my questions for this witness,
Yes.
but I'm conscious that we need to take a few minutes so that I can just make sure I've covered everything, and also to see whether others in the room may have supplemental questions. Given the exceptional circumstances of today and our later start, I wonder if I might trespass on your time.
Well, I'm sure Mrs. Cooney would like to finish her evidence
Yes.
this evening.
I would, yes.
And
I'm sure you
if we went on for another 10 minutes or so, would that trouble you?
Absolutely fine, yeah.
Is that going to be enough, Mr. Fielder?
I'm trusting it will be.
No, I'm trusting it will be.
Yes.
You're telling me.
Yes. Yes, usual way.
Yes, go very well.
Thank you. Right. Can I ask you, please, to be shown EXO 0000388? This is an email that you sent to Mr. Ashton about the smoke control system at the tower on the 10th of September, just after your holiday. Do you see that?
Okay.
And you say, Terry has promised my thoughts on the possible solution to Grenfell Tower. You see?
Okay.
I mean, do take time to have a look at it, sometime to have a look at it. You deal with ground level, mezzanine, walkway, office level. And then in the last big paragraph before the bottom, you say, the existing ventilation system is questionable, and the overall scheme theoretically makes the existing conditions worse by adding the additional risk of 2 extra residential floors to the building. It's proposed to upgrade the ventilation system, but the standard it will achieve is unknown. There are also no details on the terminal to the shaft. Generally, there is a significant approvals risk with the current proposals, particularly at walkway level. Now, if your task was limited to production of the existing fire safety strategy report, why were you sending Mr. Ashton this email, including your possible solution to Grenfell Tower?
So this email was the response, I think, to Terry's asking me to have a look at those layouts. So it's part and parcel of that.
I see. And then you go on at the bottom, the existing ventilation is questionable, as I've shown you. What did you mean by the existing ventilation system being questionable?
Again, that goes back to the existing fire strategy where we question what was actually there, and to make sure that the overall scheme, to make sure that it was up to the job of doing what we expect it to do, which was to provide adequate ventilation in the event of a design fire.
Had anybody actually assessed the existing ventilation system for its design or its maintenance between your producing your draft report and the date of this email?
I don't know whether any of the work or any of the recommendations had been done by this point. I didn't have any involvement with it, unfortunately.
Right. Do you agree that apart from this reference to the theoretical worsening of the smoke ventilation system, you made no reference here to the proposed refurbishment making existing conditions worse?
No, but in context, that statement was in relation just to this email, essentially, this proposed layout from the architects. It doesn't relate in any other way to the ongoing scheme.
Did you ever express your concern that a bad condition was to be made worse by the proposed refurbishment to Mr. Soanes at Studio E? Or Ms.
I don't recall speaking to Bruce following my holiday. I just don't recall it.
Did you relay your concerns to Dr. Barker?
I think Dr. Barker was aware of the level of concerns and the caveats we'd put in the report, and obviously that document was there for others to read as well.
Go back, please, to EXO 00001607. This is the email which I'm not sure we looked at. This is from yeah, that's right. This is from Mr. Soanes to Mr. Ashton of the 30th of August. You see that?
Yes.
And he says, we have a meeting planned for the afternoon of the 6th, which is the date Kate returns. You see that? See
Yes.
bounce back below. We looked at this earlier on, and I don't think I looked at the last paragraph with you. We need to go through the fire strategy existing draft, which makes numerous recommendations. And then in the last sentence, Mr. Soanes said, it is probably also a good time to make contact with the local fire officer to discuss the project. Were you ever asked by Mr. Soanes or Mr. Ashton to make contact with the local fire officer, or did you receive any information about that kind of contact?
No.
Were you ever asked to discuss your recommendations further after you'd come back from holiday?
No.
Did you or anyone else from Exova engage with the local fire officer?
I don't know. I assume so.
Okay.
Just simply because it was an ongoing project, but I don't know.
Did you ever take any steps to ensure that matters for further investigation were considered and addressed by the TMO? I may have asked you that before, but just to confirm it for me, please.
No, from here it went on to others in the team.
Yes, I see. Okay. Finally, can I ask you please to go back to paragraph 3.5 of your statement, page 2. This is the paragraph which refers to the baseline. You remember we discussed that earlier this morning, Ms. Cooney.
Yes.
Was there any process whereby you took Terry Ashton through your report or draft and discussed it in detail so that he could use it as his baseline for his work on the refurbishment fire safety strategy?
There wasn't any process as such. I don't recall ever having done that. I don't recall Terry asking me to go through that with him. Obviously, the document was there for him to read. So.
Right. Did you take any steps, and I think the answer from the last question is no, but correct me if I'm wrong, did you take any steps to ensure that the team responsible for putting together the fire safety strategy for the refurbishment works understood your proposals, concerns, assumptions, etc., in the existing fire safety strategy?
No, did.
Is there a reason why you didn't?
I suppose if there was any ambiguity or anything that they wanted to question, I was there to on the end of the phone to call. So I don't know. It's a fairly straightforward strategy, so, with straightforward recommendations. So I wouldn't necessarily expect it, but no, I didn't follow it up with Terry, and I don't recall Terry asking any particular questions.
All right. Thank you very much. One more question on a completely different topic. Are you aware of Exova ever having carried out a desktop study considering the compliance with BR 135, and I'm assuming you know what that is,
Yes.
of a rain screen cladding facade for a high-rise building using Celotex insulation?
No, that's a completely separate part of the business.
It's a separate part of the business, is it?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just help me? Which part of the business is it?
So in terms of assessments, it would be, I don't know the name of the, but I think it would fall under the certification business, but you'd
I see. Okay.
have to check on that.
Right. Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think we should. I've got a 2-minute credit, perhaps.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
Well, may I just break and just make sure that there are no other people in the room who want me to ask any further questions?
Well, it is usual to have a break at this
It
stage.
is. May I ask for that break?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Ms. Cooney, sometimes when counsel thinks he's reached the end of his questions, a bit of checking suggests that he hasn't. So I normally would rise for a couple of minutes at this point to give Mr. Millett a chance to see whether there are other questions that need to be put to you.
But
So I'm going to ask you to go with the usher now, and we'll rise for a short time to see whether there are more questions for you.
that would be fine. I would, if I could have the opportunity, like to go back to a question regarding, I think it was 3.3.3, where I think I could offer a little bit more information.
Was there something you wanted to complete, was there?
Yes,
Right, well, let's do that first,
yeah,
then, I think.
okay.
Just in
Yes,
case
3.3. That'll be TMO 10001925 at page 9. I'm wrong about that. I shall get into trouble.
No, first of all, is that the passage you had in mind?
It was in relation to how we were talking about diagram 52 and firefighting shafts, etc. And I was, whilst I was having a break, I was having a think of where that could possibly have come from and could it have meant anything else? And just given the way that it's written, in so much as the lobby is to provide a minimum of 30 minutes, I think in that regard, I was relating not to the firefighting shaft, but actually to a lobby off the firefighting shaft to the accommodation. So, which would typically be that. So, I think that's where that has come from. I just wanted to clarify that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Millett, do you want to follow up that at all?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to follow up on that. No, well, I might, but I mean, let's take a break. And if there's a spare question which comes crawling out of the woodwork, I'll
All right, we'll see.
explore it.
Well, Ms. Kinney, we'll have the break now. We'd like to go to the usher.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Millett, you let me know via the usher when you're ready. But,
Yes, it will not be long.
You'll not need more than a few minutes.
I will not.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett. Well, you found something.
I have found some, and some have been found.
Yes. Would you ask Mrs. Cooney to come back in, please? Mrs. Cooney, I'm afraid Mr. Millett has found a few more questions.
Okay,
I hope they won't take too long.
it's fine.
Ms. Cooney, I'm sorry to detain you further, but I do have 1 or 2 minutes of further questions. Can I ask you to go back, since you raised it, to section 3.3.3 of your report, which should still be on the screen,
Yes.
page 9. In the second from last paragraph, you say, as there is a single escape route from the building at this level, the exit should be lobbied to provide a minimum of 30 minutes fire-resisting construction. We heard your answer about that, which you'd wanted to explain just before we rose a moment ago. But would it not be important to explain to the reader that on any view, a 60 minutes fire-resisting construction was required of the door into the firefighting shaft in accordance with diagram 52?
I could have stated the diagram number, but I think it already says that in the words, with this at the time being a level of non-residential accommodation. The firefighting shaft itself has a core which is protected to 2 hours and 1 hour fire doors. As there is a single escape route from the building at this level, I think that's the relationship of the office with the firefighting shaft itself. So because it's a different purpose group, it should be lobbied off from the residential. So that's that having read it back and thought about it, and having time to kind of wonder where it was I was looking at the time, that to me would make much more sense than it's just with it saying that the exit, it just raised a question in my head whilst I was on break, so I wanted to just...
Yes, I can understand that. I mean, it's not the clearest, and it is apt to confuse, really, isn't it?
Well, coming back to it 8 years later and not having the drawings in front of me, I needed a few minutes to look at it, so that's...
Thank you. Can I ask you then to be shown EXO 50388? It's an email we looked at just before the end of your questions, 10th of September, the one you sent to Mr. Ashton. And I think I did ask you about the penultimate paragraph and touched on significant approvals risk in the last paragraph. Just want to focus on 1 or 2 questions on that. You say, generally, there is a significant approvals risk with the current proposals. To what extent were you concerned that the current proposals might not be safe?
With the proposals as they stood, and I am not aware of what eventually was chosen, the principle of once you're in a stair, you should descend in that stair to a final exit was being varied. So the approvals risk is that if we are then bringing people out of that stair enclosure without adding additional fire precautions, then that represents a significant approvals risk from the regulators, as well as not being satisfactory from our point of view.
So is it right that you were concerned that the current proposals would not comply or might not be seen to comply with the building regulations?
They carried a significant approvals risk that the regulators would not be favourable with that design. So the design needed to be changed.
Yes, it's really what I want to understand by approvals risk. I mean, by risk, do you mean there's a chance that the building control might understand that it was actually non-compliant, or that they might misunderstand and think wrongly that it was non-compliant?
An approvals risk is a risk that the risk of it being approved is diminished. So it may result in a refusal of that particular design.
Right. If you were concerned that the current proposals might not comply with the building regulations, why didn't you say so expressly?
Well, I did it in the form of this email and the one to Andrew Martin. I may well have had conversations around that as well, but I've certainly raised it in those two emails.
I mean, did you think that the current proposals didn't comply with the building regulations and there was a risk that building control would see that?
I think that the current layout as it was shown wasn't acceptable, which is why I asked for additional design changes to make sure that it could become a design which would provide the right level of safety. So in that way, reduce the risk of it being rejected.
You say acceptable. Do you mean non-compliant?
The word compliant is compliant with what? So
Building regulations.
With building regulations. So yes, essentially, if the regulator didn't feel that it met with the requirements of any of the parts of Part B, then yes, it was a risk that they could say no.
And either it complies or it doesn't. Really what I'm trying to get at
yes,
here
either it complies or it doesn't, but the way in which it can comply, are subject to various design criteria, really. There are several ways of compliance. It's not necessarily following a specific guide to the letter. There are variations that can also be equally acceptable. So in terms of the approvals risk, it's a risk of the regulators saying, no, it doesn't meet with their requirements.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Cooney, thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. I'm very grateful to you for coming down here today and helping us with our investigations. So thank you for your evidence.
No problem. Thank you.
Yes, I endorse that. We are very grateful to you for coming. I'm sorry the day's turned out to be rather longer than perhaps you had wished or hoped, but at least we've got your evidence for us today.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So
Thank
you're free
you.
to go.
Thank you.
Now, before we formally call an end to today's proceedings, can I just do two things? One is to thank the transcribers and the document managers, because it's been a long day for you as well, and your fingers, I suspect, get quite tired by this time, so thank you very much. The other thing is just to say something briefly about where we go tomorrow. Overnight, we're going to look at the responses we've received during the course of the day to the consultation note we sent out yesterday about the best way forward. And maybe I'll be in a position to say something more concrete about that tomorrow. But I think for the purposes of tomorrow, we should work on the basis that we'll continue as we have today. In other words, a limited attendance hearing, but on a voluntary basis. I'm pleased to see that there are quite a lot of empty seats towards the back of the room, and I think it would be very desirable if tomorrow as many people absented themselves as is reasonably practicable and followed the proceedings online. But we have another witness who's come from the north of England to give evidence tomorrow, and I would like to take her evidence on the basis that we have as few people exposed to the risk of numbers as we can. So tomorrow we'll go ahead on the basis of limited attendance hearing, but as I say, on a voluntary basis, and then we'll take it from there. All right, so 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. Thank you very much.